So, this is apparently the best Android phone that there is. It kind of looks like something else. I can't quite put my finger on what.
Oh, man. Well, because, you know, you could call that courage, right? Because it does take #courage to embrace the future.
Oh, you had to raise that. You had to raise it, didn't you? Look. You talk about the future, but is this the future where in 2 years from now, the Android version that was released 2 years ago is finally on most people's phones?
Yeah, like copy and paste. That was
low
quite some
blow.
innovation too, right? Like, I mean, well, eventually, I don't know.
Well, look, my phone's white, but I'll take space gray over really blue any day. I mean, really blue doesn't mean it's a depressed phone. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll give you that, actually. Man, if you really want to know what's coming for next WWDC, here's a link. It's Google I/O 2015. You're going to get a rough idea of what's next, I think.
You total biatch. You do know, right, that Donald Trump uses an Android phone?
Well,
I would drop
talking
my
about
mic if they
toxic
didn't
health
sue me.
stews,
Look, hang on. Look, what are we doing? We used to work together, right? Like, we must have had some Kool-Aid at lunchtime. Actually, stop. Get Donald Trump off the screen.
oh, yeah.
Okay, that's better. Right. We used to work together. It was really great. We became friends. Now we've just been cats and dogs in front of everyone.
Yeah, you're right. Let's get this back on track.
Let's do some intros. I mean, we've got a little bit of intro, but let's do a little bit more.
Yeah, makes sense. So hi, my name is Romain. I'm an Android developer currently working for Deliveroo in London. The past 6-7 years, I work with for different companies like Yammer, BlaBlaCar, Songkick, where I had the chance to work with Michael.
So that makes me Michael. Shall we have my picture as well?
Yep, that's it.
So yeah, hi, I'm Michael. I've written apps for about 10 years now, most recently at a company called Risk, which is an insurtech startup in London.
Yeah, working for Songkick was pretty awesome and we got to learn a lot. Today we're going to share some of this learning, but before starting anything, we'd like to state that we don't work for them anymore, so we're not talking on their behalf in any way. So yeah, basically.
Yeah. We did ask their permission and they did say yes, so hopefully they won't
shouldn't
sue us.
sue us, I think. Yeah, should be fine.
So now you know a little bit about us, we want to know some things about you. And because there's quite a lot of you, we're going to do something a little different. So we want to ask you some questions. We're going to get yes, no answers. But instead of putting your hands up, which, to be honest, I can't even see all of you, let alone count all of you, what we're going to do is we're going to use sound instead to get a gauge of your yes, no answers. Remind you to explain?
So if you would have raised your hand, just clap instead, like this. Actually, I can't do it.
I don't think they got that.
Yeah.
Try that
So
again.
we're going to ask a few questions, and instead of raising your hand, just clap instead. Yeah.
There we go.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Okay, so first question. So who here is mostly an engineer? Oh, wow.
Wow. That's a lot of engineers.
Yeah, definitely. Who here is mostly a designer?
Oh.
Okay, so that ruins half of our presentation, I think.
We should just leave now, really.
Okay, so we don't have any designer and engineer, I guess. Yeah, we have a few of them, actually. Yeah, cool. Who here is neither a designer or an engineer?
Wow. I want to talk to you at the after party to find out what you're actually here for. That's really interesting. Maybe they got free tickets, or maybe they're just here for the after party.
I'm curious too.
Okay, so we know there's quite a few of you who are engineers. So who here is mostly iOS? This could turn into a holy war. We should be very careful.
Yeah.
Mostly Android? Cool. Highly controversial, Android and iOS? Oh, good.
All right.
And what about server-side? Does anyone do any server-side? Do you maintain an API or anything like that? Cool. Oh, good few of you. That's excellent. Right, well, we were going to talk about the designers, but there are no designers here, so let's just move swiftly on.
Skip that, I guess, yeah.
So remember the rough numbers that you heard from the clapping there, because we're going to refer to them throughout the talk. So yeah, when I worked with Romain, we worked on every part of the app development, which isn't probably a big surprise to you, but what we do want to talk about today is how we work together at Songkick as a whole team. So What we're talking about there is literally a whole mobile team, so iOS and Android working together, coming up with features, designing them, implementing them, doing the QA. I've totally forgotten what I was going to say next. Yeah, that's what we really want to talk about today, which is how a culture of collaboration, where often there is division, can lead to stronger engineering teams and better products and also new friends.
Yeah, so basically at Songcake, whenever we wanted to start working on a new feature, we would start with a kickoff. That was quite a high-level summary of what we wanted to build and why we wanted it. So it was typically quite platform agnostic, so it made sense to start that as a whole team. And that was key because it sets the tone. So we work on different platform experiences, but we work on the same product at the end. And when we say the whole team, we don't just mean just iOS or Android developers. It's everyone, including QA and product managers and design and anyone that could have a good input into that.
Yeah, exactly. And it was really, really great for catching issues as well. So often we would discuss the new feature as a whole team. And I learned so many things this way. So for example, Ramon, that's my friend from Spain. Anyway, Ramon was working on the new rewrite of the Android app and was talking about how he was using RxJava and MVVM. Two things I'd never used before, but I actually now use both of them on the project that I'm working on right now. And that goes on to talk about, that leads on to design as well. So as we were saying before, we would design together. So that meant not just the iOS team working with the iOS designer, but actually the iOS and the Android developers all in the same room talking about the design for the product that we were going to build. And this is really, really useful if you want to, one, sort of develop more empathy between your team to actually create a cohesive team. But also, if you're going to have the team do QA, which is something we're going to talk about in just a minute, it really helps for everybody to understand what the feature is going to be, what they're going to QA later. And because no modern app really exists in an offline bubble, Songcake is no different. Which is how I found myself with a book on Ruby on Rails in one hand and RubyMine in the other, praying for autocomplete as much as possible, building a microservice to support the feature that we were just building.
Yeah, and most of the time we would pair on this, so we would try to have a representative from each platform in the pair.
So that was another first for me as well. So actually sitting there with an Android developer, coding together, very, very weird, but also quite a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, I remember one day, actually, there was an iOS developer coming to my desk. He wanted to know some implementation details of a feature I built a few weeks before on Android. So he started by asking me some questions about, like, you know, like how you did that, and I couldn't, like, I didn't know how to, like, I was not used to that kind of interaction, you know, like talking with someone from a different platforms, talking about specific stuff of what I did. So I started by giving him a pretty high-level description of what I did, and like I was afraid to maybe lose him if I go too much into details on Android. And then I started feeling a bit stupid when he asked for more details, because basically, even if we talk different coding languages, we still understand each other, so there's still a high chance that you're going to make everyone grow in the same team when you collaborate.
Yeah, and although we didn't actually code directly across platforms, although we paired, we did choose to QA together. So we were a very small mobile team, and as I said before, we would do kickoffs and design together so that we could then basically form our own ad hoc QA team. So we would have the iOS team actually QA the Android release before it went to the store, and vice versa with the iOS app and the Android team.
Yeah, and these kickoffs and QA sessions were also great ways to know more about the product. So being an Android fanboy, I own an Android phone, and I pretty rarely have the occasion to play around with the iOS equivalent of what I'm working on, which is pretty sad if you think about it, because it's a lot of missed possibilities to make the product grow more, like to make the product more consistent and more cohesive across the board.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things that we did at Songcake, which I'd never done before, was around sharing as well. Yeah. So we had a thing which we did each week called the Mobile Team Breakfast, which was great for several reasons. First of all, free breakfast, always a good thing. But secondly, we would get together and basically we would talk about engineering, but specifically focused on mobile. So we would just share knowledge in those sessions.
Yeah, at one point you might be staring at someone first forays into Swift, and then you might talk about some functional programming, and then you might end that meeting by talking about what's new in the latest version of Android. So yeah, that was kind of an unusual meeting for sure.
Yeah, it was really, really cool. And also we had those, the showcase every 2 weeks as well. So probably a lot of companies have them. So we'd have a showcase every 2 weeks where the whole company would talk about what we'd done during the preceding 2 weeks. But what we decided to do as a mobile team was to present as a team rather than as platforms. So another first for me, I found myself standing there holding an Android phone, Android developer next to me, and she's explaining the feature that we've just built, and I'm demoing it on a device that I never use normally, but on a feature that I know really intimately with a developer who I, in previous companies, would have kind of barely spoken to. It was a really strange experience initially, but it was also really cool, and again, a great way to build empathy as a team.
It definitely felt weird, but what we learned was that collaboration leads to like a better team that have a better knowledge of both platforms, basically.
Exactly. But it wasn't that long ago when engineers were just engineers, right? No one really worked like this. In those days, often we would talk about things like requirement specifications and timescales and costs, and only when payment had been made would we start work on our projects. In those days, engineers often had a very deep knowledge, but tended not to be very broad. You might call them a sort of I-shaped engineer, have very deep knowledge in one particular area. We know this because it's still with us these days. Sometimes it's the right thing to do. For example, if you're building a nuclear reactor controller, this is probably the kind of way you might want to build it. We often think about this as a kind of quite slow-moving, kind of reassuringly slow-moving process, maybe waterfall. But we're app developers, right? We're not building nuclear reactor controllers, or at least I'm not going to build a nuclear reactor controller on an iOS device or an Android device. You're very welcome to give it a try. Please let me know if you do. I shall leave the country. But we tend to work in agile teams, and we accept that change is an inevitable part of what we do, therefore. And we try to do as little upfront design as possible in order that we can deliver the maximum value in small iterations.
Yeah. I've always found our job quite fascinating in a way, because you could consider yourself as kind of a micro full stack engineer, because our job covers everything from in this stack, so from the pixels at frames per second to bytes at megabytes per second. So, but then this is like reducing our job. I think we do much more than that, and it's easy to forget about that. Our job also covers like communication with product managers and doing some QA as well, maybe some design. So yeah, I think being like considered as micro full stack developers is not really accurate. I think we are T-shaped.
Yeah, so this idea of the T-shape was first kind of came to the fore in 2010 with this chap, Tim Brown, who was the CEO of IDEO at the time. And the idea is that you still, the I shape that we talked about before, that's still there. That's your kind of very deep knowledge. And if we reflect on the survey we did at the beginning, when we asked you about iOS and Android, there was a lot of people doing just one and very few people doing both. So that's kind of like your I shape. That's your kind of deep knowledge in a particular area. And so yeah, I think a big tick for that kind of idea with mobile team. And then if we think about the horizontal there, so the horizontal in this T-shape is your broader skills. So how you take the skill set that you have and then you work within a wider team, bringing that skill set to the team. And we heard that some of you already are working across platform. Some of you are also coding and doing a bit of design. I suspect if we'd had more time to kind of dig deeper, which we can do later at the after party, we'd find other ways that you also collaborate. So you probably work with product management, you probably work with QA. It's all sorts of areas where you take your deep expertise and you apply it in a much broader sense. So again, I think a very big tick for the idea of these kind of broader skills in a mobile team.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that most mobile developers are T-shaped by the very nature of their work. And I think we could go even further into that and say that failing to be T-shaped will damage both your career and your product. And this is exactly how we operated at Soundkick. Sorry, coming up with ideas and brainstorming ways to, coming up with the issues the user faces, then brainstorming ways to fix it, and then coming up with the right data and right technology to fix these issues.
Yeah. So if you accept that mobile engineers are by their very nature T-shaped engineers, the next question we think is like, well, how far could you take this? Could we, instead of having where we, as we found out earlier, where you tend to be one vertical, just iOS or Android, is there a way that we could make this maybe more cross-platform and actually have a very much more generic T-shape? There's lots of tools that have tried to do this in the past. I'm sure you remember some of these. If you remember PhoneGap, you have my sympathies. But right now, there are two kind of leaders in the market. There's Xamarin and there's React Native, both of which are doing some very interesting stuff. So we were like, well, what is it about Xamarin and React Native that's really compelling? And we kind of, this is from their websites, but I think we can boil it down more succinctly again. If we could just switch across. Yeah, so I think what they're really offering is sharing of effort in order to reduce the amount of work that you have to do to deliver across platform. And the problem with this is that if you use these tools and you are kind of one of these T-shaped engineers where you're already a deep knowledge of iOS or deep knowledge of Android, then these tools don't really offer you a great deal because you now have to learn new languages, new IDEs, new frameworks, new quirks, new bugs. You know, there's a whole other world that isn't the world that you normally inhabit day to day, which you'd have to learn in order to become one of these kind of cross-platform engineers with these tools.
Yeah. So now, given that all of you are here for a mobile conference, there's quite a high chance that you all know about Swift from Apple. Actually, let's do one of these clapping survey things just for fun. So who here has heard of Swift?
Yeah. That's what I'd expect.
Yeah, no designers, so yeah. Who here actually uses Swift at work?
My people.
Now let's try something else. Who here has heard of Kotlin from JetBrains?
Oh, okay, that's more than we thought as well.
Yeah. And now who here uses Kotlin?
That's more than I thought, actually.
That's interesting. So Swift, for those who don't yet know, it's a language fairly new by Apple that can be used to make apps on most of their hardware. And recently, actually, a group was launched to support Swift on the server. And Kotlin, however, is a fairly new language as well, built by JetBrains, that can be used to make apps running on the JVM. So you can build Android apps, and you can also build server-side applications if you want. They're
actually one of the sponsors as well, so you can go upstairs and check out what they're up to. Mm-hmm. So if you've actually used these languages, used both these languages, in fact, which is what we've been doing recently, then you'll discover something very interesting, which is, in many ways, they're quite similar. They have a very similar look and feel, and they're trying to aspire to some very similar things. They're very modern, very concise, very expressive languages. Yeah, so here we are in 2017 with two new languages that have a lot in common on our favorite platform. So could that mean a new cross-platform, but also cross-layer option? Yeah, exactly. So we decided to try it out. So when we started working on this talk, we were not quite sure where to go. At first, we both knew that both platforms had a lot in common, and so it kind of made sense to start with a few pairing sessions. So I think we spent half a session trying to figure out what to build and how to name it, right? Well, naming things is hard, right? Yeah. And it had to have a good name.
Yeah, and eventually we figured out that we would build an app that would pull down some data from an API and show that to the user, like typical kind of thing that you would do for a tech task, for an interview. But then we burned even more time trying to find the right API for that.
Yeah, well, choosing APIs is hard, and there's so many cool ones now. There's like the Pokemon one, there's the Star Wars one.
Pokemon, that's one that we should have used. Yeah. Well, anyway, at some point we took a step back and came up with this plan. So during this pairing session, we would build a simple schedule app for this conference, for MCA4. Then we'd pair on it as much as possible. And we'd avoid trying to focus on the actual architecture. What matters is more the actual experience of pairing and learning. Then we'd respect both platforms, so we wouldn't build an iOS app on Android and vice versa. And finally, we'd write an iOS app in Swift and the Android app in Kotlin.
Yeah, and the sessions were really cool. Once we'd find out how to name it and obviously what API to use, we learned a lot along the way. I learned a great deal more about how similar these two languages are, and even how much more similar kind of like Xcode and Android Studio are these days. Well, Android Studio is more stable, obviously, I'll give you that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so I guess all of you are engineers, so you want to see some code, I guess.
There's like no designers here, so just throw the code up and let's get on with it. So yeah, so this is a bit of Kotlin code that I actually wrote. So Swift developers in the audience, I think you'll agree this it's quite readable, right? Like you can immediately kind of see what it's meant to be doing. It's really, really expressive and simple to understand even if you don't know Kotlin.
Yeah, and the same for this Swift class. If you're used to Kotlin, you wouldn't be lost with this one, I think.
And is it something a bit more complex? Yeah, so this is another bit of Kotlin. Again, Swift developers. Basically, this is taking some view model and binding it to a view. It's basically exactly the same kind of thing you do with an IB outlet and setting like a text on a label.
And talking about IB outlet, so this is the Swift equivalent of what you've just seen. And we didn't do any kind of code gymnastic to come to this. I think
No,
just
exactly.
happened naturally, I think.
Exactly. This is just the code that we wrote.
Mm-mm.
And we also learned that we could help each other as well. So this is if you're an iOS developer, you know about kind of recycling views. Well, you do a similar thing on Android. And the views that you get back are very generic. And Roman was like, oh, we need to cast it. I can't remember how you do that. And I was like, oh, well, in Swift, we just use like a conditional cast, which is this as question mark thing. And it just worked.
Yeah, well, shame on me, I couldn't remember how to do that in Kotlin, but yeah, I didn't know about the safe cast, and actually it was pretty weird to learn something on Android from an iOS developer.
What are you trying to say?
No, I mean, like, it was just, yeah. Okay.
We already had the intros. He said I was a good engineer.
No, that was just positive. So something. Okay, let's move to the next slide.
So one of the other interesting things was that when we started the Android project, by default, it created this layout called a constraint layout. And I said, well, how do you do UI design? And you started explaining, and you said, oh, it has this constraint layout. And I said, well, what's a constraint layout? And you said, oh, well, you describe your UI using constraints. And I was like, oh, like auto layout. And you're like, well, I'm not really sure. But I did a bit of research, and sure enough, yeah, both of iOS and Android, if you use auto layout and constraint layout, it's the exact same underlying technology now. It's this cassowary constraint resolution. So again, as I was saying, we kept finding these ways that both the platforms are kind of much more similar than they used to be.
Yeah, I think it's, generally speaking, I think it's easy to compare both platforms here. And even with constraint layout, it's interesting to see how Google moved with their way of dealing with development. And like, in a way, it's more what you see is what you get way of building your layout. And it's something that has existed on iOS for years, right? And it's something that is kind of new to me on Android, and it's interesting to see Google moving the same direction as Apple in there. And generally speaking, it's easy to compare both platforms and see how converging they are. Like, for example, permissions. Like the past few releases on Android has been a lot around like adding more rules, around permissions to close down the OS. Well, Apple is a bit opening up a bit more, I say. So
a little.
I think it's just easy to see how converging in terms of openness or closeness. You can see that, I guess.
Yeah. So let's show them what we built. Yeah. This is what we built. We built two versions of the schedule, one for Android in Kotlin and one for iOS in Swift. I just found it a really interesting experience pairing with Roman and learning Kotlin along the way, and hopefully you felt the same learning Swift. Just discovering, as I say, all the ways that these two platforms, which feel so much like they're cats and dogs a lot of the time, are actually much closer to each other than we ever realized, particularly when you look at the kind of modern languages which we now have on offer, Swift and Kotlin.
Yeah, so basically we have two OSs that seems to be more converging than diverging. Then we have two languages that have a lot in common. Then we said that both languages actually support server-side development, so why not try that too?
Yeah.
And that's how we actually found the right API to build, which is building a scheduled server for this conference in Kotlin and Swift.
Yeah. So we used an idea that's been around for a few years now, but seems to be gathering a bit of pace, and it's called backend for front end. It's very popular with companies like SoundCloud and Spotify and LinkedIn, and it was first proposed by a chap whose name I don't want to get wrong, Phil Casado, who's an ex-SoundClouder. And you can probably see from the diagram there, so the idea is you still have your very general API at the top, but you have a new layer on the back end, which is your back end for front end. And the idea is that this new layer, this vends, instead of vending kind of very generic JSON kind of view kind of stuff, it actually vends user experience specific. So you're sort of talking kind of screen level specific JSON that's very, very tailored to the particular client. So often you won't necessarily just have one backend for front end. You'll actually have a backend for front end for kind of like the native apps, and then you might have a different one for web. And yeah, the idea is to give each client a very, very specific piece of JSON that is just for the screen in question that they're trying to use, and doing all the transforms along the way.
Yeah, so we spent a few more sessions working on this, and that's what we ended up with, which is more proof of concept than anything you could use on production, but yeah. So yeah, basically we have a layer that acts as a traditional backend that returns some data from the database, so some data that might not be really useful for the mobile apps, and a lot of stuff that are not in the correct format as well, so something that would need to be reprocessed by the mobile apps. Then we have that backend for front-end layer that reprocesses that data, convert it into view models that are just ready to be bound by the apps. So the apps can just focus on what they should focus on, which is view logic and animations and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I wrote the Swift backend part of it, and so when you say Swift on the server, you kind of really mean Swift on Linux. It's pretty much the same thing. And it's interesting that there are kind of 3 frameworks which are becoming the sort of de facto standards right now. There's this Perfect, and then Vapor, and Katura. And interesting thing is Katura is actually from IBM as well. They're investing really heavily in the idea of Swift on the server side. Now, apparently, it's really, really easy to get these frameworks up and running. So actually, you said I was a good engineer. I couldn't get any of them working, so maybe I'm actually not a very good engineer, or at least not a very good back-end engineer. So in the end, I used a different framework called Curacao, which is by a guy called Kyle Fuller. And it comes with a kind of clone and deploy straight to Heroku little demo app. So I was able to kind of deploy it, throw it up to Heroku, and have it kind of running in just a few minutes. So we went with that, but I'm reliably informed that if I actually had done it properly, Perfect, Vapor, and Katura are very easy to actually get running. So let's have a little bit of the code. Yeah. So this is kind of like this would be your main if it was a kind of typical app kind of thing. But obviously this is a server, so instead of main we have serve. So you've got the hello world there, which is your default. But the interesting thing, as I said, is because it's Swift on Linux, you basically got most of the foundation available to you already. So here, basically, we're just instantiating the schedule for MT4 and then serializing it to JSON. This code could easily exist on an iOS app, and it wouldn't need any changes. And yeah, just a little bit more of the model, just to kind of show you the kind of how easy and simple it is to read. If you're a Kotlin developer, hopefully this is very easy to read. And finally, yeah, just to show you kind of what the foundation gives you. So again, as I say, if you were writing this on iOS, it would look exactly the same. It's really nice to feel quite familiar and to have all the kind of power of foundation already there for you to use, even when you're writing a kind of server-side app.
Yeah, so on the Kotlin side, so I built the backend for frontend. Yeah, I started by using this framework called Ktor, which has been built by the Kotlin teams themselves. It's pretty easy to set up. You have, in a few minutes, you can have an up and running server on your machine. But yeah, like Michael, I'm not that of a great developer as well. Yeah, I couldn't find a way to upload that to Heroku. So basically, I moved to something I was more familiar with.
Just don't use Heroku. I think that's the problem. Right?
Yeah, possibly actually. Yeah. So I ended up using Spark Java combined with Kotlin because Kotlin runs on the JVM, so you can use it with any of your favorite Java framework if you want. So yeah, I ended up using that, and this is how the code looks like. So basically, I have this is the main class that lists all the different endpoints. Here I have only one, which is schedule.json. Takes a from query parameter, pass that to the schedule repository, which returns a JSON file. So the schedule repository will query the traditional backend, get the schedule, filters it based on the from date, then converts the items into view models and returns a JSON. And the models, you've always seen that slides because basically we use exactly the same models on the Android app and the backend for frontend app, which is pretty interesting if you think about it, because if you use the same language and you have the same team of maintainers on the backend for frontend layer and the apps, you could basically have a shared code base between the two.
So you might be saying, well, this is all very interesting, but this is the tagline for MCE, right? Like, it's not about more technology. It's about better technology and more meaningful technology. So the question is, like, is this better and more meaningful? Is anyone actually doing this? Well, yeah, they are actually. In fact, I'm actually doing this. So the company that I work at, Risk, we started off with a very traditional architecture. So Java on the back end, Swift on the front end. But like a lot of you have probably felt trying to ingest a very generic API, there were lots of times where I was like, oh, really? I've got to format these dates, or I've got to convert this currency, or all these kind of things. And I kept asking for kind of changes on the back end, and the CTO was like, nope. This is a nice generic API. Keep away. You're not having it. This is not a mobile API. So I was doing a lot of transforms on the app side, and then I was reading about this back-end for front-end idea, and I kind of went in and sort of pitched it and said, like, we could do this, and you could give me all the very specific transforms that I need without kind of messing with the API. And he was like, so all those little bits that I've already done for you, I could basically remove them from the general API and get back my purity. And I was like, yes. So he was like, okay, that's no problem at all. Let's do that. And then I said, well, we're doing some microservices in Kotlin already. What if we do the backend for frontend in Kotlin as well? And he was like, okay, yeah, sure. And I was like, because then you can give me read-write access, and I can do pull requests to the backend for frontend as well. So when I want to make changes, I can often make those changes myself without having to wait for you to do them. And he was like, well, less work for me, no problem at all. Very happy to do that.
Yeah, so if we come back to our T-shape, actually, this approach will enable you to go both deeper and broader in your T. Because you will learn new things, like, for example, functional programming, if you're not familiar with it, things that kind of follow things that you already know today. And then broader, because you will have the chance to work with people from different backgrounds and different products. So you will learn typically new things.
And I noticed that a few of you did say that you work on the server side as well, and I'm not sure if there are any actual completely back-end developers here. But if there are, or if you go back and you talk about this with them and they're like, oh yeah, you want my job as well now, do you? Don't worry, it's not like that, because basically if they learn a bit of Kotlin or a bit of Swift, although Swift on the back end is maybe not quite ready for prime time, but Kotlin definitely is, they can do what my CTO has been doing with me as well, which is if they're making changes on the back end, they can actually check out the app and make the change on the front end as well and keep it in sync and just do a pull request. And so they can come down and kind of join us as much as we can go up and join them. It's empowering, it's not trying to steal anything.
Yeah, it's not really different from what we've talked so far. I think you'll still end up with a team of specialists that end up collaborating and supporting each other and make everyone grow.
Exactly. So the really nice thing about these languages that I discovered as we used them was that unlike things like JavaScript, which obviously is behind React Native, it's not like a monkey wrench. These are modern languages that are designed specifically with these use cases in mind. They're kind of simple, clean, modern, elegant languages that are designed specifically for doing both front-end work and also back-end work. They're not square pegs in round holes. They really are designed for this kind of modern world that's coming.
So hang on, we've talked about Swift on iOS and Swift on the server. Then we've talked about Kotlin on Android and Kotlin on the server. Now, what about Kotlin on iOS or Swift on Android?
Holy war, holy war, holy war.
Controversial. Well, actually, it might sound stupid, but actually, if you follow the latest news from the Kotlin team, you might have noticed that thing called Kotlin Native, which gives a way to compile Kotlin code into machine code that can be understood by these machines.
So in case you're not quite getting this, you can just see the picture. This is like a little Tetris game written in Kotlin, running on an iPhone, a non-jailbroke iPhone. You can do this already. There is actually there's a sample version of it that you can download right now. Kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah. Swift on Android. Apple would never do that, right?
No, you can keep your dirty Android fingers off of our platform.
Never. Well, actually, it might sound stupid as well, but there was a pull request that was merged last year. I'm not sure what that means. No one knows, but at least it still means that they are considering it and not saying no forever on it. So yeah, interesting, I think.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. So we think this is the beginning of something that's really, really cool. You're still going to be mobile devs, but you can work across platform and also across layer as you choose. And you're still going to have your specialisms, but you're much freer. Your team can work much more across the whole of the product that you're building. You don't necessarily have to be constrained anymore. And I don't know about you, but this sounds like a really interesting and exciting place to work as a mobile dev. I know it's the kind of team that I would like to work on in the future.
Yeah, so a few bullet points to get started. So how to get started on this? So first, do the kickoffs together, as a whole team.
Yeah, so that's kind of what we talked about at the beginning when we were at Songkick.
Now, try to do some more pairing whenever you can.
Because it's a great way to share knowledge and to build up empathy between the different platforms.
Try to share your work as much as possible.
Yeah, so that's things like we talked about before with the code breakfast and with showcases. Again, it's a great way to share knowledge, not just necessarily within engineering, but within the wider company as well.
Always try to test your app and the other app together.
Again, you're going to catch bugs that you won't necessarily see yourself. It's a great way to have an ad hoc QA resource, particularly if you're a very small team and you don't have dedicated QA. And again, you're just building up a kind of an empathy between the different platform teams.
Yeah, play around with Swift and Kotlin.
Because do you want to be Objective-C developers forever?
Or Java. And finally, just talk about the backend for front-end approach with your team.
Because everyone wants a best friend forever.
Oh, yeah.
So just to wrap up, we both know these things. Like we've seen these a million times. Yes, very clever, very nice. But again, they speak to these divisions. So we would like to propose for this new modern future mobile team that this be the new tag phrase. And I think we're about done, aren't we?
Sorry?
I've forgotten what's next.
Oh, yeah, actually.
Oh, this is interesting. I'm wondering if maybe Tim and Sundar were actually listening to our talk.
Yeah, maybe something happening, actually.
This is genuine. They were seen having dinner together fairly recently. So who knows? Maybe they were talking about Swift and Kotlin.
Must be that.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's it. Thank you. If you want to know more, so here's a few links. So link to Kotlin language, to the official link for Swift. And then if you want to know more about the backend for front-end approach, really interesting talk by Sam Newman. Then if you're really interested about our pairing sessions, which is interesting, so you can find all our work on these repos, and there's a few more.
Yeah, so if you go to one of the GitHubs, it has a link to all the other parts of the system that we built as well, so you can kind of jump around through the different projects. There's our Twitter. Tell us what you think. Tell us if you agree or disagree. Tell us if you're a cat or a dog. And finally, thank you very much to everyone that helped us to get to this point with this talk. So everyone at Songkick and also Risk and Delivery for letting us come and speak. Yes, of course, they are all hiring as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Good work, sir. Good work.
Okay, so we have like 5 minutes at least for Q&A. So are there any questions that you'd like to ask?
Hi, thank you guys for the nice talk. My question is basically, you mentioned that you are writing code for the backend while being developers for the mobile teams. So one thing is writing in the same language, but you still need to handle changing the mindset basically for backend developer, for backend developing. So how did you handle that? Because it is kind of different than mobile.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, I can talk about what happened when, at my company. And the easiest way to pitch it was, you'll have less work to do, which seemed to go over very, very well. So I kind of said, look, I can't really do any major harm. If you just let me have a layer that's in front of your general API, we'll still use all the same authors we did before. You can show me how to build this service, but I would like to maintain it, and I'll do pull requests. I'm not just going to merge. That seemed to be all that was really necessary, just so long as they had a little bit of control still to just see what was going on. That was all that was really needed, and you'll have less work to do. That seemed to be the very key phrase.
And I guess if you really want to have more support, you can still do some more pairing as well. And I guess I agree there's a different mindset I have from my past experience, I had exactly the same situation. And I think, yeah, pairing solved a lot of these issues, and I guess pull requests as well, yeah.
Yeah, and so but the nice thing about the back end for front end is that if they are concerned, then obviously they can keep control of the actual sort of general API and just give you control of this layer where you're kind of in a little bit more sandbox. So there's a lot less potential harm that you could cause.
So any more questions? If not, I will have one question. May I?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. So I see like the industry moving to similar framework or similar patterns like functional reactive programming or unidirectional binding and so on. So, and the APIs for those are usually very similar on both platforms. So for example, Eric's Swift and Eric's Kotlin or something like this. Do you think that it will help converge those platforms? It will help the collaboration further? Or is it easy and understandable even if you stick to the vanilla APIs that the system frameworks provide?
Yeah, I guess the language is just one thing, right? Like, it's just something that helps the collaboration. Because if you had two languages that were completely different, then I guess that wouldn't be really easy to just. You wouldn't even think about that, right? If I had like a backend for frontend written in Objective-C, I wouldn't even look at it. I mean, it's so different from what I know that it would be like a new skill to learn. Like with Kotlin and Swift, the good thing is that they're all so similar that it's not like a high jump. Once you know one, you're really familiar with the other one. So definitely.
Yeah, and I think that's what we were trying to sort of emphasize is, you know, you're not getting rid of any of the specialists. You still need people who understand the platforms really, really well. But by being more open-minded and having languages which allow a bit more freedom of movement, you can essentially move around the layers and the platforms much more easily, and pairing as well. Obviously, like if you're going to move and if you're going to go and do some Android code, and Android isn't your kind of platform of choice, then you're probably going to need someone to kind of guide you through the SDKs at the very least. You might know Kotlin very, very well. That doesn't mean to say you can put a view on the screen and actually put some data on it. You're still going to need some people to kind of guide you around what is constraint layout or these kinds of things. But it's just, I think the interesting thing that we discovered was that in the past, you had kind of Java and Objective-C, and they are like chalk and cheese. They're so radically different that people don't think about moving across. But the interesting thing about Swift is that lots of people who do Java, for example, have kind of come and started playing with Swift. And then I think you can take that further and say, well, if we had Kotlin, that it might go both ways then. So these kind of people doing Objective-C and Java right now might also kind of move in and dabble in Swift and move across to Kotlin or vice versa. And I think that's where it starts to get really interesting, is that you then become much more T-shaped, exactly as we were saying before.
So any more questions? Okay, so if not, thank you for an awesome and inspiring talk. Please give them a round.
Thank you.